before you start adding more taxes, what you really need to do is enforce the ones you have better. So the question is, do we want the government to have more money? Do we really, and for what? And so what you see on NHI is, yeah, we want NHI, but we haven't funded it. And that's a big issue. If you have lots of wealth that sits, you don't do anything with it. You just let it grow and you enjoy the fruits of your trees, but you don't ever pluck them. That wealth is very hard to tax.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. And today we're having a fascinating conversation. At the center of any economy is exactly how the government gets its revenue. Revenue to build bridges, schools, hospitals. And at the center of that process is, of course, the tax system. And today we're joined by none other than Keith Engel, who's the head of the South African Institute of Taxation, to talk about our South African tax system and some of its political and economic dimensions. Thank you so much for joining us on SMWX.
It's an honor.
The honor is ours. And before we get into the weeds with taxation, what got you interested in this important aspect of any economy, its tax system?
Well, I think in history has shown that the core of any government is tax. If it can't raise money, it doesn't exist. So just a quick thing on my background. I was originally, as you can hear, an American. I still have that in the background. I came over as a U.S. advisor. And this was during the Clinton era. And what we were trying to do is help the South African government. We were very concerned at that time, if a government doesn't have enough revenue, it'll collapse. And you'll see a lot of countries, developing countries, have this problem. So the tax system on the one hand is about the core of survival. The second is being a history person. You'll see that history is often made by taxation followed by revolution. It's very much a European thing, but you look at the French Revolution, you look at the American Revolution, you look at the English Revolution. Magna Carta came down to taxation. So if you're looking at the core of society...
Taxation without representation.
That's right. That was a U.S. thing. Right. But if you look back at Magna Carta, the problem was the king was having too many wars. And he was costing people too much money. And at that time, the people were being taxed too much with the nobility and the people underneath, and all the nobility went against them. And so the first rights came to that. So tax really comes down to your property rights as an individual. But then, as we see in a more modern society, what is the collective demand, not from the king, but for the people themselves? And so it's right at that core that makes it fascinating from a political point of view.
Absolutely. And in terms of the history of South Africa, let's say post-apartheid, at that crucial time, we come into a situation where the economy is actually in a very weak state, and the new government then has to develop its own philosophy around taxation. Could you talk us through kind of the evolution of how the ANC government has seen the taxation system?
Yeah, well, you can see, again, it's a big difference from 94. So originally in 94, it was a minority government for minority people, and that was what it was all about. And they were running that pretty effectively for themselves, and everything else was subservient to that. The difficulty is that you were not really taxing the majority of the people that needed to be taxed. So what you found is that there were a lot of people who were undertaxed because they were favored. You were also in a period of sanctions. So where you came in 94 was a situation of economic hardship. So there were a number of reasons why the nationalist government surrendered, basically. And one of which was the cupboards were bare. And that was, I think, to the horror of the ANC. They thought they'd come in and we have something here, because they looked at all this infrastructure, they looked at all this power, and they realized there was nothing there. So in the early 90s, the first was just a basic period of assessment.
Right.
And it was like, okay, what do we have and what do we have to do? And the main goal of the ANC was, we're trying to uplift the entire population. What do we have to work with? So that's when you had the RDP plans. There was a lot of plans, and then there was a transition of moving the top layers of government from the Nats to the ANC. Right. So there was that scope that went on. The big one that came on there, and again, we'll talk about it later, but I think we're looking at our 30 years of taxation. taxation.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at our 30 years of taxation, that period was known as the Katz Commission period.
Right.
So Michael Katz of ENS, we'll give him a plug.
Famous lawyer, yeah.
Very famous lawyer, very charming person. But he had an army of people. Dennis Davis was with him at that time, and a whole bunch of others, where they just went and looked at the entire tax system from start to finish and said, okay, where are we getting our revenue? Are we getting it in the right places? And we want to make sure that we get more revenue, but we don't want to cripple the economy at the same time. But the big issue was it seemed that there was a lot of gaps in the system. And the gaps were twofold. One, it was a policy gap, and the second was an administrative gap. So the first thing you would see is in the late 90s, 1997 to be particular, they changed the way they did the tax system. So originally, the Ministry of Finance was running everything.
Right.
And they were running both the operations and the policy. What happened was the Revenue Service became independent. They took into account income tax and customs, all fiscal issues, and their goal was to focus on enforcement and implementation. Right. That was the goal. And Treasury, being the policy heads, would stay behind and run it from there. So that's where they were by the late 1990s.
Sure.
The early 2000s, having had all the Katz Commission reports, now the goal was to start bringing that into the law and into bringing into actual day-to-day operations. So that's how I came in. So the U.S. Advisor Program, at the time, Trevor Manuel and Maria Ramos were trying to get more support, and they wanted more international best practice. So there was a predecessor that came before me, then I came in, and we started to enact big changes. And the big changes were for broadening the base and lowering the rates. So the concern was only a certain segment of people were being taxed. The super rich, they complain today, but back then the super rich and the upper rich weren't being taxed at all.
Wow.
So if you were a salaried worker, we hit you with everything we got. And then if you had asset wealth, good for you. And you walked away.
So the middle was being hit quite hard, and the other, both sides of the curve then weren't being hit as hard.
That's right. Well, I think what they did go after was the lower income was through the VAT. So the VAT came in.
Right. So everyone was being hit except the super rich.
The super rich. Because, and I don't think people realize that. And you'll see that every once in a while they say, look at all those people in the informal sector. They're not being taxed. They're getting away with something. Look at the taxi drivers. Yeah, they are getting away with some income tax, sure. But the value added tax hits them a lot more.
Sure.
And that was one of the last acts the nationalists did. But again, in all good tax systems, a value added tax is usually preferred. So we were not hitting the rich at all. The other thing we were not hitting was the foreign side, all the investments abroad. Because in the old days, we were isolated and we were doing everything in to get out there. Now we were open to the world. So at that time, the goal was to make sure we moved to an international system and that, worldwide tax came into play. So we broadened the base.
Right.
We went after lots of avoidance schemes. And that's what went on from 2000 to 2012. And then we were shifting. We were trying to broaden the base, and what Trevor Manuel was very successful in doing was giving that back in the form of salary relief. So your marginal brackets were going up all the time. So they reduced the number of brackets, and then the higher brackets were coming in later and later. So those were the good years.
Right.
And then we were also doing things for international alignment. We had some funny taxes known as the STC and other things that internationally people just didn't get, and that caused confusion, and we got those out of the way.
Right.
And those were the golden years. Then we started to run into a bit of trouble. So poor Pravin Gordhan was trying to hold on to the golden years at the beginning, but we started having a period of massive overspending.
Right.
And from 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, we didn't really notice that much in the system. And also there was a Great Recession, so we could get away with some things. But by 2013, things started to change, and the Zuma years started taking hold, and the great Van Rooyen, I think it was 2015. So I would say from 2014 to 2018, we went into a period where we were taking too much.
Right.
And so Gordhan was desperate to try to not raise taxes. So what you saw him trying to do is excise taxes, gambling taxes, but he was having trouble keeping the momentum on the income tax. So every year you have to adjust for inflation. If you don't, your brackets creep in earlier and earlier.
Right.
And so what's happening is we were not adjusting the way we should for inflation. We started putting the top rates back. It went up to 45. Dividend tax went up. Capital gains rates went up. So what you found by the time the Ramaphosa period began, we had broad base and high rates. So we were worse off than we were in 94.
Right.
Because now everybody was being overtaxed, except for the people who were outside of the system. And maybe some of the super rich, you can still argue they have the same problem internationally.
So there was something of a creep from broaden the base, lower the rates to, okay, we're keeping the base broad, but somehow the rates are now also going up.
That's right.
Virtually on everyone?
On everybody. Right. It went across, except for the people, where the only issue that was left, and that was the thing that Judge Dennis Davis brought up, is he said he liked the wealth tax. He lost interest in it for different reasons. But the concern was internationally, if you have lots of wealth that sits, you don't do anything with it. You just let it grow and you enjoy the fruits of your trees, but you don't ever pluck them. That wealth is very hard to tax. So internationally, there's a complaint about that. And so South Africa has that complaint as well. The problem is most of that super wealth has moved offshore already.
Right.
And it's not really where we think it is. So that was not so successful. And maybe part of the problem is a lot of the super wealth is now the government. And the government officials. So that we sort of died down on, but you see a bubbling. The big issue that came after the great period of crisis was the period of, I will call that the Kieswetter period, the period of renewal and rejuvenation.
By all accounts, Kieswetter has been an excellent commissioner. I don't know what your thoughts are, but I even saw at some point the EFF praising his role at SARS, which completed the entire political spectrum, acknowledging the important gains that have been made there.
Yeah, I think he's been a very good commissioner. I think he's done a lot with a lot less than Gordon had. And I think things have been, I get in trouble for saying that because people don't want to hear me say that. But I think overall, I don't think too many people could have done it better. And what he did, and that's been the basic where we are now in the last 4 or 5 years, is we're not going to change the law too much.
Right.
But what we are going to do is we're going to improve enforcement. And so that's why he keeps talking about IT and third-party data and all of this. And that's all about what people say they make versus what they really make is a difference. So he wants to know what they really make and verify it with third-party data. Right. And to some extent, they've made some good gains. And they have made gains on, you'll see today more charges against fraud and outright corruption. And there is elements going after wholesale invasion. But the problem is that's very hard for revenue services to do. Right. So the challenge ahead for him is that while his IT system may be better, and again, that's also creaking a bit, because I think more money is needed. I think they've got money, but they need more. In order to get good third-party data, it's not enough to have your own system. You have to have everything around. So if he really wanted to be effective, he needs his municipalities to have good data and all of the other departments to have good data. Then he can gain a lot. Unfortunately, those systems are a mess. So I'm not sure if those gains are going to keep going. And the second thing that's always hard is getting people who are living on cash. And I think as you've seen in the news reports lately, there is a lot of cash out there. And the problem is if you play the game wholly illegal and you get away with it and the people who are legal are not, there's a lot of resentment in the system. So I think the years ahead for him are tougher. He's managing to hold on. And the only danger that people see is that when times get tough, you can face aggression. So sometimes when you face aggression, it's more or less the power of the institution driving the money on people who just don't want to fight. And so you're seeing some of that noise again. But overall, I would say that it would be very hard to beat what he did.
I'm interested in the wealth tax in more depth, so I do want to go there. But in terms of, we've done the evolution up to perhaps this moment of the coalition government.
Yeah.
Which way do you see the wind blowing in terms of tax policy? And can you give us an assessment of how you see perhaps the next 5 years unfolding, and whether there'll be any change from where we've arrived at?
Well, I think to some extent too, you'll have to tell me from your on the outside perspective as well, because I think the question is, what are the politics demanding, and what can the system sustain?
Yeah.
So right now, I think it's hold your own pretty much the same. So the one that you mentioned first is wealth. Okay, so the wealth tax, right? So there was a big push on the wealth tax, and the big driver for that was Judge Dennis Davis. But he pulled back and he said, before you start adding more taxes, what you really need to do is enforce the ones you have better. And when you look at some of the wealthy, they've set up a high net worth individual unit. And part of the problem is the enforcement needs to be improved.
Sure.
So, and that would help quite a bit, because a lot of people getting around the tax system, it's about non-disclosure.
Right.
So what a lot of people do, and the best way around the system is simply not to disclose. If I don't tell you, that's why Kieswetter wants third-party data. He says, well, I know that you told me you only make so much, but we looked at your bank accounts.
Sure.
So there's been a push more on that side. And a lot of times, too, people are doing structured planning that really doesn't work, which is a bit of a concern, that some people sell products and they say, you're just not going to get caught. So don't worry about it. But that's not really legitimate. So the theory has been go after that. But the question is there a desire for a wealth tax or a land tax?
Right.
And I'm not seeing a huge groundswell except for a few elements. You'll see, a few people politically pushing for it in isolated sectors, but I don't see a broad-based push.
No, I agree. I think the GNU is very much a let's hold everything in place and just try and get gains off stability, rather than making any particular massive moves on tax, on economic policy. But I wonder what you think of the wealth tax, how it could work or should work, or whether it would be counterproductive. Because, every government wants more revenue, that's for sure. But the question is, would a wealth tax actually produce that revenue? If so, how? And if not, why not? What are your thoughts on that? Because it's quite a fundamental question for the idea of resolving economic inequality. How do we actually get a fair redistribution that doesn't also harm the economy at the same time?
Well, I think that, so the one that came up originally was about redistribution. So our income tax system already does a lot of redistribution.
Sure.
It does it not only because we have the income tax, but the government does it. So, I think you may have even talked about it in one of your sessions, where if you look at the government spending, the bulk of the government spending is redistributional. The vast majority of it.
Sure.
So, we have a Gini coefficient problem, but it's not pre-94 anymore, right? The government is trying to solve it. And if there are different Gini coefficient problems, it's due to corruption, which is a different set of things that are picking up. The issue of wealth tax is a challenging one, because there are two things that are in people's mind. One is, well, why are the rich so rich, and are they being taxed proportionally? So that's the one that Buffett concerned, right?
Sure.
Buffett would say, well, look, I'm really rich, but you're not taxing me. And the reason why Buffett is not being taxed is he sits on his wealth, right? If you sit on your farm, you're not going to be taxed on it. If you're going to sit on your shares on the JSE, you won't be taxed on it. It's only when you sell it do you really get it. And generally, if you're smart with wealth,
very interesting.
You don't sit on it. So right now, the U.S. is having this big debate. And of course, then a whole bunch of other debates get in there. But if you're looking at it technically, the question is about fairness, right?
Yeah.
Proportionately, my income, my wealth is growing, but I'm not being taxed currently. Every time you make money, you get some cash. So they hit you. When they're getting richer by the day, that isn't being taxed because it's not being sold. It's not being cashed out.
Right.
So the issue is, well, if I do tax people, can I really tax people and force them to cash out? And that's the debate in the U.S. saying, okay, now I'm going to tax you on all your farmland, and now I'm going to force you to sell farmland to tax. We don't really like that very much. The argument about forcing you to sell shares on the stock market, that's not so strong, because how bad is that? You can sell some of your shares. So there's a liquidity issue versus an appreciation issue.
Sure.
The second one that comes in, there's a double tax issue. You've already taxed me once. Now you're going to tax me again? So the system has to work out in a way that you should only be taxing the additions to wealth and not what you taxed before. And we haven't come up with a good instrument. And then what happens is people come up with rough justice instruments where, the rich start screaming you're double taxing, and then the people are saying you're under taxing. And so the debate is sort of settled down. And what you're finding is that they're pushing again on enforcement and closing loopholes. So where you're seeing a lot of that change is offshore trusts, offshore foundations.
Right.
We might not necessarily change the rules, but we're going to make you disclose a hell of a lot more. We want to know where your money is. And so our goal is to bring sunshine to it, because again, if we don't bring sunshine to it, and we can't see it no matter what we do. And that's where the push is. And then political pressure, like the International Journalists Association, I think ICIG or something, they're going around saying, look at all these rich people who are hiding their money. And that's where it seems to have gone. Then there's an element we need to tax the rich more. You'll see that again in the U.S.
Right.
The argument comes at this second argument, and this is where it gets pulled back. People feel we're taxing too much, and our government is too big. So the forces, is government too big or is it not? And that's the one I'm not so sure in South Africa, because if you look at it right now, what they're expecting the commissioner to do is to get more revenue than economic growth. Economic growth is 1%, and we seem to be getting like additional 4 and 5.
Right.
That's a very troubling number, because the government, whatever you do, the government is taking more than it should be. So what people start saying is, you're taking too much, and you're going to take from the rich, and they're going to come back more for us. And we don't want more big government because we don't trust you.
Well, I think one of the problems that the government also has is a credibility crisis. I think people would often be prepared to give up even more if they were sure that would build more schools, hospitals, make sure that poverty was alleviated. But when you start to doubt that the money is actually going anywhere, that also brings a certain credibility crisis into the system.
Yeah, and I think that's the one that was first highlighted. So the big one that got highlighted was, there was a period where the revenue service was doing the right thing, and the arguments by Trevor Manuel and Pravin Gordhan and all them is, we're building schools, we're building roads. But by 2007 and 8, people said, no, it looks like you're filling people's pockets. And so then that has infected the whole tax debate ever since. It's very hard for them to push for that. Now, maybe with the government of national unity, maybe that's going to have a little bit more credibility, but I think people's patience have been tested. So fairness, there comes a point where I know that I take from the rich. Okay, so you're taking from them for yourselves. You're only going to come back to me again. And I think that's infected the debate quite a lot, unfortunately.
What about the question of tax revolts, which have stemmed from that? There have been some incendiary suggestions that it should happen. They've never really caught on. But to what extent do you think that is a danger to the tax system?
Yes, it's interesting. Now, South Africans are very tolerant people. I think you've also talked about your politics. We're not big fans of radicals. When you start sounding a little radical, we just get turned off. So tax revolt has a radical feeling to it. But people do get a bit radical. So the word tax revolt, again, is in the United States that started the revolution, the Magna Carta, the French Revolution. All of these, a number of revolutions, at least in the West, began over taxation of some kind. I don't see South Africans looking for a revolution, but we do say, well, if we can see the system is weak, we're just not going to respect it. And so, as I said, the toll roads. People didn't like it. They didn't have a revolution, but they said, you can't enforce this. We're not going to let you enforce this. And so they simply didn't pay. TV license, they didn't pay. Parking tickets or any form of those kind of tickets, they don't pay. Unfortunately, when it comes to SARS, they know that if they don't pay, they're going to get themselves into a lot of trouble. And you don't, unless everybody decides not to pay, and they're going to have to really work at it because the revenue service, there's a lot of internal collection mechanisms. I don't see it happening. And so there was a point where there was some anger. I think somebody threatened to burn down SARS national office or something, but nobody never came at that. So I don't see that. I think the revolution, to the extent there's really anger, will bubble up somewhere else, but it seems those moods have subsided at the moment. So I don't see that. It's just a question of enforcement.
You mentioned the relationship between foreign capital and South African capital, but also moving capital out of South Africa into foreign jurisdictions. To what extent do you think we're able to capture that at the moment? And to what extent do you think we're missing a lot of capital flight or capital flight movements?
Yeah, well, that's more of a capital flight issue. Sometimes it gets into tax. We have a problem because people take a lot of money offshore. So one of the problems in our economic model, and this is my concern about with economics in general, too many people, when they have theories, they don't look at our economy. Okay?
Sure.
So if you take a look, and there's a lot of battles about savings. So we need encouraging of savings. That's great. But in America, the savings goes back into American businesses.
Yeah, absolutely.
What you see people with surplus savings is they don't trust us. So, right, we have 45% offshore, the institutional rule, that when people have big savings, they're taking it offshore.
Very interesting, yeah.
So that means that we want the savings onshore to lower the cost of capital. So you're not getting that benefit. Now, that the tax system can try to capture some of it so that at least you're not losing tax when you're losing savings. But the bottom line is you really want the savings to be here. And the really issue now comes to economics and trust. So that's, again, what I'm saying. South Africans will not fight you, but if they find an escape hatch, like I forgot to mention the taxis, they don't pay either.
Right.
So if they think they can get away with it, they will. And if people can move money offshore, we don't have exchange control anymore because we don't want that. But we don't have enough faith in the economy. And so taxes come in there a little bit because if people want to move money offshore, they need to be tax cleared. Now, there's not exchange control, but you need to prove to SARS that you've been validly paying your tax. And sometimes that feels like exchange control. But when it comes to savings and growth, it's got to stay on shore to make it worthwhile. And also there's this view of, well, I think it's good for a company to be international because then it brings back dividends. The question is, does it bring back dividends? And are we really getting our benefit for it? But I don't see that. And I think one of the issues too is we overemphasize foreign investment. So there's this big thing. I was talking in the car with a friend about it. And it's like,
absolutely.
Wow, I mean, we'll get these guys to come in and they'll invest. It's important to get some of that investment, but what kind of investment are you getting?
Yeah.
A lot of investment is more extractive than beneficial. Now,
absolutely.
I believe in foreign investment. Don't get me wrong. I'm not anti-foreign investment, but there's a difference, and people don't understand the difference. So they're either pro or against. And it's not going to solve our problems. We really need to make sure we believe in our own economy. And the tax system to try to save that is a poor substitute.
And we're going into the 11th annual tax Indaba. What's the idea behind this Indaba, and what will some of the focus areas be in this year's installment?
Yeah, so every year we have our annual tax Indaba. So we do a lot of things like this during the year. The goal is it's sort of an annual recollect. Where are we this year? And so we've been doing it since, 11 years now. So it's about 2013 since we began. We've got everybody coming there. We've got the government. We have SARS. We have Treasury. We have all the big firms, both accounting and law firm and all of that. We've got a lot of the large corporates that come. But the purpose this year was a 30-year discussion of where are we at and where we're going, just as we are now. And that's why we're doing this. This is more at a political level. We're going to get into more detailed kind of discussions. Because as a tax person or any professional, you need to know where you're going and where you're at and what is really the thinking behind things. So when something's happening to you, people tend to take it personally. They figure somebody's out to get me or there's something unique going on. They need to understand the trends. So at this point, we're saying at 30 years, where have we been in all of these discussions and where are we going? And we are at an inflection point. And part of the problem of that inflection point is in 94, we had lots of revenue opportunities. So even though the cupboards were bare, there were many new spaces and easy wins we could have. And even in the early 2000s, when Gordon was changing enforcement, he had a lot of quick wins available to him. Kieswetter didn't have those quick wins. That's why I think his was a harder way to go. Now the wins are getting harder. So the question is, okay, we want those wins? Where do we want them? How much money is it really going to get us? And now the question becomes the harder one, which is a little outside of our Indaba. What is it for? So one thing that's been discussed is the NHI, right? Now, in theory, a lot of people support the NHI.
Sure.
They like the European view. There's a big debate about that, but there is a good chunk of people, and I think the country is more center-left than center-right.
Yeah, I think that's right, yeah.
And I would think the elections didn't change that. And as I think most people in theory would favor an NHI and that kind of thing, but because we know there's no implementation, we don't trust it. So the question is, do we want the government to have more money? Do we really, and for what? And is it really going to give us benefit? And so that debate not having been stalled, it makes it harder to push through on tax. So what you see on NHI is, we want NHI, but we haven't funded it. And that's a big issue. Because right now, rates are at 45%, top rates. They kick in very early. So they kick in about 1.4 million rands, something like that. Maybe somewhere, maybe it's higher, maybe 1.6.
Which these days is not as much as it once was.
No, exactly. And so 45% is quite a bit. And you could say that's wealthy, but when I convert it to dollars, you're talking about middle. You're not talking about super rich people here.
Yeah.
So, and the Europeans, they might bring that rate down, but you're getting things of benefit. So now if you're going to fund that NHI, I don't care what anybody says, you can cut out a few things, you can make some efficiencies, you're going to have to raise rates on payroll. And payroll is income tax. And most likely you're going to have to put that up to 50.
Sure.
Maybe more. And the question is, do I really want to pay? And then also, do I want to lose my benefits? So we didn't really solve this debate in this whole thing. We had a big debate. And I think as you've said on your channel, it was more about personalities and history. There was never a philosophical debate of where we want this country to go. And I think that's why we're really kind of drifting, because we're not really sure where we want to go.
If you were to look at this next 5 years, what do you think are some of the key interventions that we can make that would take us into maybe not another golden era, but at least a period of progress?
Well, I think the biggest thing is economic. I think really we need to get our growth back. And I think, to be fair, the Treasury keeps saying that. That's why also the Treasury is saying we're not very reluctant to raise rates. They don't really want. They prefer to broaden the base and get the guys who should be paying to be paying than hitting more people. The point is, what we really need to do is get a government that's functioning again. And so maybe it's not so political. Maybe it's about just better service delivery. If we can do better with what we have and just deal with it, fixing the public hospitals, say, or fixing the schools, or whatever thing that has to happen, if we do it better, maybe you can restore faith in the country. And maybe we're drifting toward that. The difficulty is, are we? And that comes down on the ground, because the problem is we've got a lot of people in government that are politicians who are doing the implementation. And, bottom line is you need technical people to do that stuff. Now, you're lucky that some people just have that skill. To be fair, Pravin Gordhan was a chemist.
Sure.
But somehow he was good at it. But he's the exception. not the general rule. So for us, it would be best if we can focus on that. But I don't know if that's the problem. Is politicians like labels. So when they like labels, they like chasing new things because somehow a slogan hopefully gets them votes. So, I mean, one of the questions is about NHI. They felt that was going to get them votes. I don't know if it did or not. I have no idea. Some people said it lost them votes. But again, I don't have, what really matters. I don't think it was a priority item for people. I think it's the bottom line is people worried about electricity. And I have to say, the government seems to have done rather well on that one.
Yeah, to all of us, well, certainly to my surprise, it almost overnight switched. So
and so the people there are people who are capable there. So where if the government can come together without ideology and focus on service delivery, then maybe we can say we want new services. But again, I don't know where this government's going because everybody's playing a game of chicken with each other right now. And it's more of a defensive game. So maybe that's okay. My feeling is probably the best thing to do is sit with what you have, do it better. And for business, that's probably not a bad thing because even if things are not perfect, what business hates the most is uncertainty. I invest, I plan to get so much money, and if I don't know what my range is going to be, I'm not going to take action because it's too much risk. And so maybe if things just settle down, you might get some natural green shoots just by holding the ground. But again, I think the problem is the government of national unity is it'll accidentally fall that way. That would be my view.
Well, Keith Engel, thank you so much for joining us on SMWX and all the best for the tax Indaba.
It was an honor. Thank you so much. Hope to do it again.
I hope so too. And thank you very much. Make sure to like, share, comment down below with your thoughts. And thanks for joining us for another installment of SMWX. Aye.